It's high noon. And it's part two. Let's continue with the Blood Meridian.
Because even though the story isn't first person, that the kid has within the tale.
Okay, I'm gonna reduce the echo. Hey.
Story is the bias McCarthy has is always the
Wait a minute. Actually, I'm gonna pause for a second. Okay, so I guess the bad audio is his fault, not mine.
view some characters as mysterious or righteous, only for later in the story them to be described as dogmatic or evil. And that's because
I'm gonna see if I can edit this part out.
the kid sees it. We also learn information about peoples and groups in the story as the kid and gang as a whole does. So, as there's quotes and pages I read that have to do with terms like savages or barbarians, that is, again, the kid's perspective as he is introduced to this world and its effects. They get to the town and Sproul decides to hang back because his arm's injured, so the kid starts looking through the houses. As he does, he finds some food, but he also finds the charred remains of people who have been burned alive and the slaughtered remains of families. As the kid makes his way back to where Sproul was, he looks through the courtyard and the story says, when he returned to the square, Sproul was gone. All about lay in shadow. He crossed the square and mounted the stone steps to the door of the church and entered. Sproul was standing in the vestibule. Long buttresses of light fell from the high windows in the western wall. There were no pews in the church, and the stone floor was heaped with the scalped and naked and partly eaten bodies of some 40 souls who barricaded themselves in this house of God against the heathen. The savages had hacked holes in the roof and shot them down from above, and the floor was littered with arrow shafts where they'd snapped them off to get the clothes from the bodies. The altars had been hauled down and the tabernacle looted, and the great sleeping god of the Mexicans routed from his golden cup. The primitive painted saints in their frames hung cocked on the walls as if an earthquake had visited, and a dead Christ in a glass bier lay broken in the chancel floor. The murdered lay in a great pool of their communal blood. It had set up into a sort of pudding crossed everywhere with the tracks of wolves or dogs, and along the edges it had dried and cracked into a burgundy ceramic. Blood lay in dark tongues on the floor, and the blood crowded the flagstones and ran in the vestibule where the stones were cupped from the feet of the faithful and their fathers before them, and it had threaded its way down the steps and dripped from the stone among the dark red tracks of the scavengers. Sproul turned and looked at the kid as if he'd known his thoughts, but the kid just shook his head. Flies clambered over the peeled and wigless skulls of the dead, and flies walked on their shrunken eyeballs. Come on, said the kid. They crossed the square in the last of the light and went down the narrow street. In a doorway, a dead child with 2 buzzards sitting on it. Sproul shooed his good hand at the buzzards, and they batted and hissed and flapped clumsily, but they did not fly. They continue to walk through the desert. Sproul says that his arm is beginning to stink, or in other words, it's infected. The 2 of them become so thirsty that they begin to hallucinate an oasis in the middle of the desert. They eventually keep walking until they get to a road leading up a cliff face, and around the corner, they see a Mexican soldier along with a company riding their way, and at the front, the leader is sitting on Captain White's horse, with Captain White nowhere to be seen. So if, a Mexican soldier is riding White's horse, things aren't looking too good for White. The leader approaches the 2 and sees that they're thirsty and offers them a drink of water. The 2 drink as much as they can, hurriedly stealing it back and forth from each other. After giving them the water, the leader says, "When the lambs is lost in the mountain," he said, "they is cry. Sometime come the mother, sometime the wolf. He smiled at them and raised a sword and ran it back where it had come from and turned the horse smartly and trotted it through the horses behind him, and the men mounted up and followed, and soon all were gone. The leader delivers an ominous line about how they need to be wary of the wolves of this country. As they continue to travel through the desert, a wagon of a family of 4 come by, and the 2 of them effectively hold up the wagon so they can hitch a ride to some place that is in the middle of the desert. So the 2 of them hop in the wagon, drink most of the family's water, and then sleep the night in the wagon in front of the family's house. Up to find that Sproul in the wagon in front of the family's house. The next morning, the kid wakes up to find that Sproul has died of his infection over the night. And then shortly after realizing this, the Mexican army shows up because, the family whose wagon they semi-hijacked called the police. So the soldiers, knowing that this kid is one of the renegade American soldiers who came to mess with Mexico, arrest him and take him into the nearby town. In the town, there is a large parade of people dancing and merchants selling things, and as the soldiers drag the kid through the middle of this party, they throw him on the ground, and when the kid looks up, someone is holding in front of him the severed head of Captain White floating in a jar. The kid spits on the ground and says, "He ain't no kin to me." And of course they would celebrate the death of these guys. They came into their country to just cause problems. When they kill the leader, they're going to, have a parade about it and, I guess, put his head in a jar. So that's what happens to people who set out to be pirates, but they claim to do it for their own greater purpose or because they have some greater stake or merit in the world. They die and their body is made a spectacle as those around them suffer and bleed as well. So the kid is taken to jail, and then shortly after that, he is transferred to Chihuahua City. When he gets to the Chihuahua City jail, who else is also in that jail but his friend Toadvine? Well, I use the term friend kind of loosely. The guy that he tried to kill in a knife fight and then they burnt down a hotel together. So Toadvine's in this jail as well, and because of their brief history, the 2 develop a sort of camaraderie between each other. There's some brief banter between the 2. One of the jail keepers has gold teeth, so Toadvine keeps saying that he wants to kill him so that he can take the gold teeth. They're in a corral for a while that just has like a high wall around the corral, no fence, and these children hop up on the wall and start throwing rocks at him. So the kid just takes like a small stone and chucks it as hard as he can at a kid, and it says it hits the kid in the head, the kid falls over the wall, and they never hear from that kid again. So I guess the kid killed a child with a rock who was just standing at the wall throwing pebbles at him. And then one day, as Toadvine, the kid, and another friend that they met, who is known now as the Veteran, one day as they're out scrubbing the streets of the city, a group of men ride in on horseback and ride into the governor's courtyard. These men are described as absolute monsters. They're barbaric in nature. They're wearing the skins and furs of several different animals. They have knives on their hips that go down to their knee. They have every manner of firearm and bladed weapon you could imagine. Not to mention that most of these men are white, which is particularly strange considering they walked into the governor of Chihuahua City's courtyard dressed as they did with no problem. And who else is riding among them except, foremost among them, outsized and childlike with his naked face, rode the judge. His cheeks were ruddy, and he was smiling and bowing to the ladies and doffing his filthy hat. The enormous dome of his head, when he bared it, was blinding white and perfectly circumscribed about, so that it looked to have been painted. He and the reeking horde of rabble with him passed on through the stunned streets and hove up before the governor's palace, where their leader, a small black-haired man, clapped for entrance by kicking at the oaken door with his boots. The doors were opened forthwith, and they rode in all, and the doors were closed again. This is, finally, the Glanton Gang. They are riding into Chihuahua City to deliver their payment of scalps to the governor as per their contract. Toadvine sees this and thinks this might be their ticket out. Sure enough, as they're cleaning the streets the next day, Toadvine managed to talk to a member of the Glanton gang and gets them an in. See, the Glanton gang constantly loses members given the nature of their capital. So, because of that, they're constantly looking for new people to refill their ranks. Anyone who knows how to fight. So, Glanton makes a request to the governor, and the three men, Toadvine, the kid, and the veteran, are all released into John Glanton's care. And with that, the kid, Toadvine, and the veteran are now officially and finally for the story members of the Glanton gang. The child who had nowhere to go, who was willing to join any tribe or people as long as it meant killing and as long as it meant money, has now found the perfect home to do just that. And it seems that by pure chance or perhaps fate, he has once again crossed paths with the judge himself. This
Meet Loom by Atlas.
mysterious figure who is set apart in any room that he exists in. So what does that mean for the kid? Does that mean he's finally fit in and found a place that he will exist freely? Or is this going to be a Cormac McCarthy novel? Let's find out. So the three men ride out with the Glanton gang from the town that they were once prisoners in, now hailed as heroes. Initially, we meet several of the more interesting characters in the gang. It seems to be that there's about 30 of them at this time, and while several of their names are mentioned sparsely throughout the book, I'm just going to talk about a few who are important, because spoilers, a lot of people die, so we're just going to be talking about the ones who actually do something. Of course, we have the judge and Glanton, who we'll talk about more as the story goes on, but there's also members like the ex-priest Tobin, who joined the gang sometime shortly after the Mexican-American War. Despite being an ex-priest, he still holds some views of God and religion in a place of secrecy, which is very interesting as the gang's actions begin to unfold as the story goes on. There are two men in the company who are both named John Jackson. One of them is a white man and the other is a black man, so the gang refers to them as White Jackson and Black Jackson, respectively. That may be surprising to hear that this gang of headhunters in the 1850s has a black man in their ranks. But as we're going to see, the Glanton gang, save for the judge, holds no values or morals or any set of rules when it comes to the actions they commit. They are solely soldiers of fortune. There are several instances in the book where they talk about the
So basically, pretty much just pirates.
savagery and evil of the Native American people, and then in the next chapter, ally themselves with them. There are several points in the book whenever someone in town mentions that they don't like Black Jackson being there because he's black, that the gang members will agree with them and talk about how he's the member of an inferior race, only to then turn around and murder the guy that they said that to. They hold no values or morality, at least none that they can't be bought out of. And while it may seem respectable that a gang at the time has a black man in their ranks, it is solely because Black Jackson is also a murderous killer. And that is exactly the kind of men that Glanton needs, not caring for their race, religion, or creed. The gang also has four
Hmm. You know, what's funny is that in my webcomic, you won't see this character for a while now, but I'm planning on, introducing a character who, isn't care too much about, who basically, has a gang that's kind of like the Clanton gang in a way, a group of mercenaries and all that. I have been kind of introducing a character like that into my into the webcomic I am currently working on. So yeah, just thought I'd mention that.
Delaware Indians in their ranks who mostly stick to themselves and don't really interact with the Delaware Indians for their race, religion, or creed. The gang also has four Delaware Indians in their ranks who mostly stick to themselves and don't really interact with the rest of the gang, at least not socially. So while they are out on the plains headhunting Native Americans, there are four Native Americans in their ranks. There is a Mexican man in the
Talk about the kind of ironic, ain't that?
company whose name is Miguel, but the Americans don't care to pronounce it correctly, so they just call him McGill. There's a scout named Webster who frequently hunts and travels out with the Delawares. There's a man named David Brown, often called David, hunts and travels out with just call him McGill. There's a scout named Webster who frequently hunts and travels out with the Delawares. There's a man named David Brown, often called Davy Brown, who has a intense propensity for violence and seems to relish in a lot of what the gang does, more so than the other members, again, excluding the judge. And the last member that I'll mention right now is a man named Bathcat, who previously lived on the island that is today known as Tasmania, where he used to hunt Aboriginal people for sport and for money. So, coming to the American West to hunt Native Americans is a normal day in the office for this guy. In his introduction, it mentions that
Disgusting.
he wears a necklace of human ears from people that he's killed, and several members of the gang take
Wait, the Aboriginal hunter was that?
day in the office for this guy. In his introduction, it mentions that he wears of the gang take pieces of humans as trophies after a killing. Several members of the gang take pieces of humans as trophies after a killing. In the
That is disturbing. That is gross. Oh my god, that is evil.
description for Bathcat, there is a blink and you'll miss it line that prophesies his death. Toadvine and Bathcat are having a conversation
Which character again?
after a killing. In the description for Bathcat, there is a blink and you'll miss it line that prophesies his death. Toadvine and Bathcat are having a conversation about the two Jacksons, arguing which is going to kill the other first, because the two Jacksons hate each other, probably because they're both named Jackson. Well, it's also mentioned later that White Jackson hates Black Jackson because he's black, but I'm sure having the same name also doesn't help. While they're discussing this, the book says, Toadvine glanced at the man's forehead, but the man's hat was pushed down almost to his eyes. The man smiled and forked the hat back slightly with his thumb. The print of the hat band lay on his forehead like a scar, but there was no mark other. Only on the inside of his lower arm was there tattooed a number which Toadvine would see in a Chihuahua bathhouse, and again when he would cut down the man's torso where it hung skewered by its heels from a tree limb in the waste of the Pimeria alta in the fall of that year. Whenever I first read through this, I had to read over that section a few times. It's just giving normal descriptions of what the gang members look like, and then it mentions that Bathcat has a tattoo that Toadvine would see again whenever he pulled his corpse that was hung by its heels on a tree in the middle of the desert.
Ready to master your
Fate is a reoccurring topic in this story that becomes more prevalent as the story goes on. And it's interesting that even in the introduction of this character, his death is already set in stone, as if it was something that was always meant to be. So as the gang is in this small town, they're waiting for a merchant to come to sell them weapons. Whenever the merchant arrives, he hands Glanton, again the leader of the gang, a Colt revolver from a box of several Colt revolvers. In testing out the pistol, Glanton pulls back the hammer and just starts shooting animals that are around the town. He shoots a cat, and it says that the cat explodes. He shoots a chicken. He shoots a goat. And then after looking over the gun, he says, I don't think this is worth $50. So he haggles with the salesman over the price, and it seems that the murder of the animals was completely inconsequential to him or anyone else in the gang. A captain of the Mexican army walks into the center of town because, these strangers are shooting guns at random things. And as soon as the Mexican captain starts talking about locking the men up, the judge jumps down from his horse and immediately starts talking to the captain in Spanish. As they're speaking in Spanish, the judge continues to shake his hand and then walks the captain through the parade of these killers and introduces all of them to the captain one by one. Come to find out later in the story, the judge speaks several languages and has been all over the world. In the story, fluently speaking Dutch, German, Spanish, and English. As the judge is
Is
walking the captain through the group of men, he talks of their bravery and how they're each respectable dignities as the men stand there with human fingers and necklaces of ears. When they get to Black Jackson, the captain remarks that it's strange having a black man in their company. So immediately, again in Spanish, the judge launches into a diatribe about how Jackson is part of an inferior race and how the whites and Mexicans are so much more prosperous and blah blah blah. And Black Jackson, who can't speak Spanish, asks the judge what he's saying, and the judge effectively tells him not to worry about it. Again, the morality of the gang is whatever best suits them in the moment. As the men are about to leave the town, a family of performers comes out to ride with them. See, at the time, any area that wasn't immediately in the city or jurisdiction of a police force was effectively lawless. So if you traveled out by yourself, you were easy prey to not only the animals and elements, but also robbers and killers who may be on the path. So if you were a family traveling for anything, it would be smart to travel with a group of armed people. So, in exchange for money, because that's all they care about, Glanton allows this family of performers to join them through the desert. I'm going to mention it now because it comes up a lot and I can't stop at every instance of it. Nearly every time that they travel out into the desert, they are completely engulfed by death that lays all around them. I mentioned one instance earlier whenever the kid and Sproul went into the destroyed village and there were all the dead bodies in the church. Well, that kind of thing happens constantly. Also on that journey, the kid and Sproul came across a thorn bush that was skewered with dead babies. Setting out on this journey, they find the bones of Apache families who were lined up and shot by Mexican soldiers. Every time that they journey out, there is instances of the world that they inhabit constantly reminding them of what it is. Hanged bodies swinging on the sides of road with words like murderer painted on their chest. Entire cascades of horses and merchants line the gutters of the roads, having been shot for the crime of being present. As I talk about the details of this story, just know that death surrounds every aspect of it. They sit around the fire that night, and Glanton looks at the father of the Mexican family of performers who he's allowed to come along with him. Glanton looks at the father and asks the man if he tells fortunes. Begins to get his family and asks the man if he tells fortunes. The showrunner's excited and begins to get his family together so that they can perform a fortune telling. They do this by having the father hold a deck of tarot cards in front of one of the gang members. And as he does it, his wife, who's also one of the performers, sets on a log facing out into the darkness of the desert night. One of the gang members draws the card, and as they do, the woman begins to cry out into the desert to receive what the fortune of the man is. Black Jackson goes first, and he draws the card, the Fool. As the lady chanting begins to say his fortune in Spanish,
which Jackson?
To the desert to receive what the fortune of the man is. Black Jackson goes first, and he draws the card, the Fool. As the lady chanting begins to say his fortune in Spanish, Jackson begins to ask the men around the campfire what she's saying. Also, there are entire conversations in this book that are entirely in Spanish. For this book, Cormac McCarthy learned Spanish just so he could read the records easier and also give accurate depictions of Mexican speech. And also, while I'm mentioning it, McCarthy wrote this book over the course of 15 years and moved to El Paso, Texas to do so, having traced the route of the Glanton gang several times during his time writing it. Historians have read the novel and remarked that it's about as historically accurate as a book can get. Anyway, so Black Jackson is standing around the fire, and he first...
Well, then I guess you can forget about my comment about not trying, but how it's not supposed about the historical accuracy stuff and all that. Like, wow. Well, I guess this book does have some good historical accuracy.
asks Tobin, the ex-priest, what the woman's saying. Tobin says that this is all idolatry and witchcraft, and he doesn't want to be a part of it. Eventually, the judge smiles at Jackson and says that what this woman is saying is that in Jackson's fortune lie all of theirs. And when Jackson asks what he means, the judge laughs and says that it means he's supposed to stay away from Rome. The Fool's card is often associated with ignorance or new beginnings. And the implication here seems to be that Jackson is in a position to follow after whatever he chooses. He's at the start of the rest of his life. And whatever actions he does from here, moving forward, will determine his fate as well as the fate of the rest of the gang. After this, the showman then takes the deck of cards to the kid.
Ah, that's interesting. Very interesting.
The kid draws and receives the Four of Cups. As this is all happening and the woman's chanting and everyone's looking at the kid, he begins to get kind of scared and nervous, and he looks over at the judge, who's partially naked, by the way. He's naked from the waist up. He's just wearing his pants. So this giant 7-foot man is leaning over right next to the kid and laughing while staring at him. The kid looks around the rest of the campfire and sees that no one else is laughing and tells the showman to get away. So the showman stops. The Four of Cups is most often associated with stagnation or a lack of purpose, which is
Well, that perfectly describes him.
very fitting for the kid at this point. He joined the military and a group of crazed killers just because there might be some money involved, with no regard for his life or the life of others. The kid is heading down a destructive path, and it seems that from his choices, he has no concern in the matter. Finally, the showman makes his way over to Glanton, the gang's leader. Glanton's hesitant at first, but since everyone else is doing it, and since he's a little drunk, he decides to play along. After Glanton takes a card, the story says, the juggler folded shut the deck and tucked it among his clothes. He reached for the card in Glanton's hand. Perhaps he touched it, perhaps not. The card vanished. It was in Glanton's hand, and then it was not. The juggler's eyes snapped after where it had gone down the dark. Perhaps Glanton had seen the card's face. What could it have meant to him? The juggler reached out to that naked beldam beyond the fire's light, but in the doing, he overbalanced and fell forward against Glanton and created a moment of strange liaison, with his old man's arms about the leader as if he would console him at his scrawny bosom. Glanton swore and flung him away, and at that moment, the old woman began to chant. See, up until this point, every time that someone draws a card, the showman has been reading the card out loud so that his wife can tell their fortune with it. Glanton rose. She raised her jaw, gibbering at the night. Shut her up, said Glanton. La Coroza, cried the beldam. Invertido, carta de guerra, de venganza, la vicin rude sobre un rio obscuro.
Okay, so river in inscuro unseeable river. I believe he said it's inverted before. Think something about roses. I wonder if he'll translate for me. My Spanish is very, very, very lacking.
Glanton called to her, and she paused as if she'd heard him, but it was not so. She seemed to catch some new drift in her divinings. Perdida, la carta está perdida en la noche. Un maleficio, cried the old woman. Que viento tan malienta. By God, you will shut up, said Glanton, drawing his revolver. Coroza de muertos, lena de Jesus, el joven que...
Autos. That's death. Autos, that's dead. Oh, death, that's dead. Related.
The judge, like a great ponderous djinn, stepped through the fire and the flames, delivered him up as if he were in some way native to their element. He put his arms around Glanton. Someone snatched the old woman's blindfold from her, and she and the juggler were clouded away, and when the company turned in to sleep and the low fire was roaring in the blast like a thing alive, these four yet crouched at the edge of the firelight among their strange chattels and watched how the ragged flames fled down the wind as if sucked by some maelstrom out there in the void.
Yeah, in case you didn't hear me, Murtos means like believe it either means dead or death or something. I believe mortis is death related in some way.
Vortex in that waste opposite to which man's transit and his reckonings alike lay abrogate. As if beyond will or fate, he and his beast and his trappings moved both in card and in substance under consignment to some third and other destiny. Glanton saw what the card was, more than likely, at least for a second, and then either hid it so that the showman couldn't see it or threw the card away. But at the same time, the woman knew exactly what was on the card and begins chanting about this boat of death, this ferryman of death.
Ah, I was right. Well, about the death part, I didn't quite get the boat. But it did get a river, so yeah.
And whatever it is she's saying, or whatever she's about to start saying, Glanton is terrified of it. He begins to draw his gun, threatening to shoot her, but the judge stops him. I could explain what this ferryman of the night might mean, but I think it will mean more if its points revealed later.
Yeah, night. That's noches. Yeah, noches means night.
In the story. So with that, the next day, the gang continues on their points revealed later in the story. So with that, the next day, the gang continues on their travel. They meet up in the town with a few of the scouts who had went ahead to see what was down the trail. And the scouts, Webster and a couple of the Delawares, come back with an old woman. This old woman is an old Apache woman who was left behind at an abandoned market some ways up the road. The woman is so old that she can barely walk, and she trembles to herself and shakes, barely looking at the knees of the men around her. This portion's particularly graphic, but I find it important to read, considering it sets the tone and several of the events that will soon follow. Glanton crossed in front of his horse, passing the reins behind his back. "Watch her, Cap, she bites." She had raised her eyes to the level of his knees. Glanton pushed the horse back and took one of the heavy saddle pistols from its scabbard and cocked it. "Watch yourself there." Several of the men stepped back. The woman looked up, neither courage nor heart sink in those old eyes. He pointed with his left hand, and she turned to follow his hand with her gaze, and he put the pistol to her head and fired. The explosion filled all that sad little park. Some of the horses shied and stepped. A fist-sized hole erupted out of the far side of the woman's head in a great vomit of gore, and she pitched over and lay slain in her blood without remedy. Glanton had already put the pistol at half-cock, and he flicked away the spent primer with his thumb and was preparing to recharge the cylinder. "McGill," he said. A Mexican, solitary of his race in that company, came forward. "Get that receipt for us." He took a skinny knife from his belt and stepped to where the old woman lay, and took up her hair and twisted it about his wrist, and passed the blade of the knife about her skull and ripped away the scalp. It says after this that no one in the company is paying any attention to what's going on, none except for the new recruits. Because this is the nature of blood money. This is the nature of what the economy for killing was at this time. Didn't matter how old or feeble they were, combatants or not, you were paid for native scalps, and it didn't matter who those scalps came off of. And everyone's okay with this. It's just the nature of their business. And if anything, an elderly woman who can't fight back is just an easy paycheck, or a receipt, as Glanton refers to her scalp. The violence can continues throughout the story, and I'm not going to read every instance of it verbatim.
Good.
Because it's a lot. There's several people who love this book who talk about how they couldn't read it on the first set through. And it's certainly brutal, but I feel it is entirely not only justified, but needed. There are so
Yeah. Yeah, that is quite true. Indeed, every now and again, mankind needs a great big meal. Be hurled up to its face.
many tragedies, and not just world history, but specifically American history, that get overridden as a statistic. We hear both in school and movies about these men of the Wild West who would hunt down the natives, or they would fight back against, the no good outlaws of the country. And we kind of just brush them off as numbers. But whenever we hear something like so many people killed in a battle, or scalps that were sold for cash, or people hanged on the side of roads, I think it's important that we don't lose the brutality of that. Like McCarthy here certainly has not. This book came out in 1985 at the height of the good guy cowboy aesthetic.
Wait, the book came out in 1985? It's that old? Huh. Oh. Oh, it's McCarthy's fifth book. Oh. Oh. McCarthy has been writing for a long time. If this is his fifth book. Man. 1985 and still no film adaptation. Oh god. And after hearing about that, the scalping, I think I can understand why. Like, that's extremely brutal. Even if it were animated, it would still be brutal. Ugh. Ugh. At the very least, it would be very hard to make a good adaptation.
Of the West. And as kind of a counter to that, it puts a highlight on how brutal the nature of manhunting actually is. It's not heroes with swelling music and a chiseled jawline fighting back against the people who matter less than him. It is most often these monstrous, almost animalistic people who prey on the weakest targets they can find. And to emphasize the historic and thematic evil of the story, the violence matters. The performers separate from them in this next town, and the men walk into a bar. While in there, an old man begins to cryptically talk about how Mexico is a dangerous country and how these men are heroes, but there is a cowboy on the plains who's looking to kill them, vaguely referring to death or the devil or some concept similar.
Ah.
The entire time they're in this bar, there is a man moaning in the back of the bar, seemingly at the end of his life, just while everyone else is drinking and carrying about as usual. On their way out of the bar, Toadvine and Bathcat have a short conversation. "That was his son," said Bathcat. "Who was?" "The lad in the corner cut with the knife." "He was cut?" "One of the chaps at the table cut him. They were playing cards and one of them cut him." "Why don't he leave?" "I asked him the same myself." "What did he say?" "He had a question for me. Said, where would he go to? The land is so desolate that the man's son was stabbed in a card fight and is about to die, and the man just keeps running the bar, as usual. Like, what does the death matter? And even if it did, what would they do about it?" Between the religious symbols to the death that surrounds them to the fortune teller, there are constant signs that they should stop this journey before they begin it. And the men continue to ignore these signs at every remark. Well, at least one of them picked up on all the clues the universe was laying down. Remember the veteran? The guy who joined the gang with Toadvine and the kid? Well, the next morning they wake up and he's just gone. The judge interrogates the
Smart.
kid and Toadvine about it, asking where the man went to, and Toadvine just says he figures the man quit and they have no idea where he went. It seems that the veteran realized that this was going to get a lot worse before it got better, so he deserted. In response to this, Glanton sends 2 of the Delawares to go find him. That night, the gang is setting around a couple of campfires. And it says that there's no real rules to the gang. As mentioned earlier, they don't really care about race, at least not when it comes to the members of their rank. But it seems like the men naturally segregate between the people they're most comfortable with. So that night at the fire, all of the Delawares and McGill, the Mexican I mentioned earlier, along with the new members of the gang, are by one fire, and everyone else is by the other fire. Black Jackson walks up to the fire with everyone else, and White Jackson stops him and says that his kind can go sit at the fire where everyone else is sitting. In other words, telling him to get over there with the natives and the Mexicans and the newcomers. In the conversation between Black Jackson and White Jackson, we have this. The white man swung his head, one eye half closed, his lip loose. His gun belt lay coiled on the ground. He reached and drew the revolver and cocked it. 4 men rose and moved away. You aim to shoot me? Said the black. You don't get your black ass away from this fire, I'll kill you graveyard dead. He looked to where Glanton sat. Glanton watched him. He put the pipe in his mouth and rose and took up the officialmore and folded it over his arm. Is that your final say? Final as the judgment of God. The black looked once more across the flames at Glanton, and then he moved away in the dark. The white man uncocked the revolver and placed it on the ground before him. 2 of the others came back to the fire and stood uneasily. Jackson sat with his legs crossed, one hand laying in his lap, and the other was outstretched on his knee holding a slender black cigarillo. The nearest man to him was Tobin, and when the black stepped out of the darkness bearing the Bowie knife in both hands like some instrument of ceremony, Tobin started to rise. The white man looked up drunkenly, and the black stepped forward and with a single stroke swapped off his head. 2 thick ropes of dark blood and 2 slender rose-like snakes from the stumps of his neck and arched, hissing into the fire. The head rolled to the left and came to rest at the ex-priest's feet, where it lay with eyes aghast. Tobin jerked his foot away and rose and stepped back. The fire steamed and blackened, and a great cloud of smoke rose, and the columnar arches of blood slowly subsided until just the neck bubbled gently like a stew, and then that too was stilled. He was set as before, save headless, drenched in blood, the cigarillo still between his fingers, leaning toward the dark and smoking grotto in the flames where his life had gone. Glanton rose, the men moved away, no one spoke. When they set out in the dawn, the headless man was sitting like a murdered anchorite, discaled in ashes and sark. Someone had taken his gun, but the boots stood where he'd put them. The company rode on. They had not gone forth 1 hour upon that plain before they were ridden upon by the Apaches. Life is so inconsequential out here that these 2 men, who yes, hate each other, both Jacksons, get into a simple fight where White Jackson expresses prejudice, saying that that Black Jackson should go sit with the other undesirables, as White Jackson would see them. And Black Jackson just says, is that your final say? And when White Jackson says yes, Black Jackson gets a Bowie knife and cuts his head off at the campfire. And everyone, other than the mention of the ex-priest jerking his foot away, has no reaction. Glanton just gets up and goes to bed, and the next day they take his gun, but they leave his headless body setting up on the log with his boots set up next to him. His death, the death of a man they've probably rode with for years at this point, is just a thing that happened.
Well, I guess you ever said that Black Jackson will kill White Jackson. Well, he's one of that bad.
A coincidence, a circumstance of fate. And there's no sense crying over it, so why say anything about it? The next day, a group of Apaches ride out to fight them, and the gang dismounts their horses and begins to shoot back. In the battle, one Apache is killed and the others ride off. The judge walks up to the dead Apache and begins to disrobe him, taking his...
So I wasn't paying attention.
Dismounts their horses and begins to shoot back. In the battle, one Apache is killed and the others ride off. The judge walks up to the dead Apache and begins to disrobe him, taking his personal effects from underneath his clothes, before scalping the Apache as they do any other native they kill. It's their first sign of the judge cataloging the world and effects of others around him, and it'll come up more as the story goes on. It's also mentioned that that afternoon, the two Delawares who went out on a scouting mission come back with the veteran's horse, with the veteran nowhere to be found, most likely having been shot by the two Delawares for desertion. You can take, hurt, and kill whoever you want, but you can't leave the gang. That's the one rule that they all seem to stick to. As they continue on their journey, they come across more dead bodies, a carriage of people who had been shot to death before they whip the horses and send the carriage full of corpses to just walk out into the desert. The gang eventually comes across an old of people who had been shot to death before they whip the horses and send the carriage full of corpses to just walk out into the desert. The gang eventually comes across an old abandoned presidio. Presidio is effectively like a plantation house, not necessarily a mansion, but a large house that several people would live out of. And from inside of the presidio, they can see smoke rising. So the gang goes up to enter the compound. Whenever they come to the door and knock on it, the first thing Clanton yells is he says, "Come out if you're white." Eventually, the people inside let them in, and the gang finds that these are 5 survivors who are near death because of their starvation and dehydration. They said that the group they were with were attacked by Apaches, and these were the only survivors who managed to take shelter in this abandoned house. And they have great survival instincts as they're just letting camp smoke go up into the air for anyone around to see. The 5 men seem crazed and starved. The first thing they ask for instead of food is tobacco. They go inside one of the offices of the Presidio, and there is a man who is holding a wound and bleeding onto the floor of the house, seemingly having been attacked by the Apaches some days earlier. Irving, the doctor in the company, walks up to him and says, "What have you done for him?" He said. "Ain't done nothing. What do you want me to do for him?"
Big tobacco makes it easy to.
You hear that? No, too big tobacco is manipulating you. I guess those people ought to hear this side. Oh.
He said, "Ain't done nothing. What do you want me to do for him? I ain't asked you to do nothing." "That's good," said Irving, "because there ain't nothing to be done." Outside in the courtyard, there is a horse that got bitten in the face by a snake, so its entire head is swelled into this throbbing mass, and the horse is making awful noises. Like, they should definitely put it down. So looking outside, "Why don't you shoot that thing?" said Irving. "Sooner it dies, the sooner it'll rot," they said. Irving spat. "You aim to eat it and it's snake bit?" They looked at one another. They didn't know. Also inside of the Presidio is a 12-year-old boy who's described as a mixed race between Mexicans and a native. And it seems that he was there when the 5 others got there, because whenever they ask about him, the men say that they don't know who he is. And there's this one quick interaction that didn't mean anything to me on a first read-through, but means far too much to me now, where it says, "Who's this child?" said the judge. They shrugged. They looked away. Glandon spat, shook his head. We will come back to that. Later, out in the courtyard, the judge is explaining to these 5 scared men how the earth works. He's explaining to them how the rocks hold the secrets of God and how the earth itself is an extension of God. And then whenever they nod like they believe him, the judge laughs at them, at their foolishness, and so willing to believe anything that someone who seems to be smarter than them tries to say. That night, there's a storm outside, and as all the men are inside, it says, "The men who had been on watch entered the room and stood steaming before the fire. The black stood at the door neither in nor out. Someone had reported the judge naked atop the walls, immense and pale in the revelations of lightning, striding the perimeter up there and declaiming in the old epic mode." Clanton watched the fire silently, and the men composed themselves in their blankets in the drier places about the floor, and soon they were asleep. So in the middle of a storm, the judge is completely naked on the roof, yelling old poetry. The judge, as we're going to find out later, is one of the most terrifying characters I've ever read about, and this kind of imagery doesn't help. That next day, as the men are about to leave, they find the child dead in one of the cubicles. He was lying face down naked in one of the cubicles. Scattered on the clay were great numbers of old bones, as if he, like others before him, had stumbled upon a place where something inimical lived. The squatters crowded in and stood about the corpse in silence. Soon they were conversing senselessly about the merits and virtues of the dead boy. So something killed this child in the middle of the night, and we'll talk about what that might have been later. Whenever Glanton goes to leave, the squatters who were staying there say that they want to join him, and Glanton just ignores them and rides off. They don't have sense or a horse to ride on, so they're useless. And the men ride away as they hear the crazed inhabitants switching between cursing God and singing hymns. Later on, sitting around the camp during the day, the ex-priest, Tobin, is teaching the kid how to mend a leather strap. I want to be careful about my language here. Tobin is not a good man by any regards. None of the people in this story I would classify as good men, at least none of the main characters. Tobin is still responsible and complicit with the murder of dozens, if not hundreds of people. But he does seem to have an affinity for the kid. He looks after him, he talks to him consistently, and in this scene, he decides to give him some information about the gang. While he may be compassionate to those in his group, he's by no means a compassionate man. As the two continue to talk, while speaking of Tobin, it says, he glanced across the fire toward the judge. That great hairless thing. You wouldn't think to look at him that he could outdance the devil himself, now could you? God, the man is a dancer. You'll not take that away from him. And fiddle. He's the greatest fiddler I ever heard, and that's an end on it. The greatest. He can cut a trail, shoot a rifle, ride a horse, track a deer. He's been all over the world. Him and the governor, they sat up till breakfast, and it was Paris this and London that in 5 languages. You'd have give something to have heard him. The governor's a learned man himself. But the judge, the ex-priest shook his head. The judge is a mystery. This man who seems to be of so many different cultures and experienced in such education, for some reason is now roaming around the desert hunting down natives for money. While talking about godly gifts, Tobin says that God speaks in the least of creatures. He watched the kid. For let it go how it will, he said. God speaks in the least of creatures. The kid thought him to mean birds or things that crawl, but the ex-priest, watching, his head slightly cocked, said, no man is give leave of that voice. The kid spat into the fire and bent to his work. I ain't heard no voice, he said. When it stops, said Tobin, you'll know you've heard it all your life. Is that right? Aye. The kid turned the leather in his lap. The ex-priest watched him. At night, said Tobin, when the horses are grazing and the company is asleep, who hears them grazing? Don't nobody hear them if they're asleep. Aye. And if they cease their grazing, who is it that waits? Every man. Aye, said the priest, every man. The kid looked up. And the judge? Does the voice speak to him? The judge, said Tobin. He didn't answer. I seen him before, said the kid, Naco Doches. Tobin smiled. Every man in the company claims to have encountered that sooty-souled rascal in some other place. Tobin rubbed his beard on the back of his hand. He saved us all. I have to give him that. And from there, Tobin begins to tell the kid the story of how the Glanton gang met the judge in the first place. Tobin tells the kid a story about one time the Glanton gang was down to 14 men when they set out on that expedition with 38. All their gunpowder was used up and they were running scared from the pursuing natives. And then as the Glanton gang, out of gunpowder, dehydrated, are riding through the middle of the desert, Tobin says, then about the meridian of that day we came upon the judge on his rock, where in that wilderness by his single self. Aye, and there was no rock, just the one. Irving said he'd brung it with him. I said that it was a mere stone, for to mark him out of nothing at all. He had with him that self-same rifle you see him with now, all mounted in German silver, and the name that he'd give it set with silver wire under the cheek piece in Latin. Et in Arcadia ego. A reference to that lethal in it. Common enough for a man to name his gun. I've heard Sweet Lips and Hark from the Tombs and every sort of lady's name. His is the first and only ever I seen with an inscription from the classics. So the gang is riding out through the desert, and then just setting on a rock in the middle of nowhere in an act that Irving says the judge must have brought the rock with him. Just sitting on the rock is the judge, a 7-foot tall, albino, hairless man just waiting for them to show up with a rifle slung over his back. The inscription engraved on the rifle, "Et in Arcadia ego," is a phrase that's used in a lot of classic poetry and stories, and it translates to, "Even in Arcadia, there I am." Arcadia was seen as sort of an idyllic paradise in a lot of stories, and the I referred to in that sentence is referring to death. It's an old saying that effectively means even in the best places in the world, death still exists. So on the judge's rifle is engraved the phrase, "Even in Arcadia, there I am." When the Glanton gang asked where he came from, he said that he was in a wagon company and just decided to start walking across the desert. So the judge says, "Can I ride with you guys?" and gets on one of their spare horses and just begins traveling with them. The gang is still being chased by the natives, so the judge instructs them that they begin heading towards this mountain off in the distance. As they get closer to the mountain, they realize that it's not a mountain and is in fact a volcano. As
I'll be honest, this Judge Kyoto is definitely beginning to seem a bit like a demon.
they're making their way up the mountain, the judge keeps getting off the horse and scraping up pieces of flint and metal and volcanic rock. This is again as they can look out on the horizon and see the Apache horses getting closer. Eventually, the track gets too treacherous for them to ride, so everyone's leading their horses. And as they are over these couple of days, the judge is getting guano from bat caves and charcoal, and he's burning it in an oven, and no one has any clue what he's doing. Tobin also mentions that at this point, Glanton was so ready to die, he didn't really care. Eventually, they make it to the top of the volcano, and as they do, they see that they are completely surrounded by the Apache, and they're probably going to die any minute now. As the men are worried about this, they look over, and the judge has dug out a little hole in the ground, and he's put all of his concoctions of charcoal and volcanic rock into the center of the hole, and he's peeing on it. And as he does, he orders the men to hurriedly get over here and start peeing on the mixture as well. As the men are peeing on it, the judge gets down on the ground, half naked at this point, and begins to knead the mass of charcoal and guano and pee that people are actively peeing on him with, and he just starts to mold it until it becomes this black clay. So the judge takes this concoction and he spreads it with a knife on the hot rocks. And for an hour, as it's drying, the men are standing around watching the Apaches get closer, and the judge is sitting off to the side just drawing pictures in a notebook. And after an hour's passed, he stands up, walks over to this dried concoction, and he picks it up, and it's so dry it's almost powdery. He takes the powder, shoves it into a shotgun barrel, and fires, and sure enough, the gun goes off. The judge was making homemade gunpowder this whole time. And now, while stinking, he's made enough rudimentary gunpowder to supply the entire company. So he orders the men to grab the stinking gunpowder and shove their guns full, and with the balls of ammunition and the firing caps that they still have, they manage to defeat all of the Apaches, not losing another man. So this random figure in the middle of the desert leads them to a volcano where, whilst waiting to be killed, he makes gunpowder out of the rudimentary materials he can find, and the gang is saved. On finishing this story, it says the ex-priest turned and looked at the kid, and that was the judge and the first I ever saw him. He's a thing to study. The kid looked at Tobin. "What's he a judge of?" he said. "What's he a judge of? What's he a judge of?" Tobin glanced off across the fire. "Ah, lad," he said, "hush now. The man will hear you. His ear's like a fox." So, just the wildest story of how the judge came into the gang's life, but not only that, whenever the kid just asks the basic question, "What's he a judge of?" Tobin tells him to not bring it up again. The judge is an oddity. He's this constant figure, this shape that exists with the gang through their journey. I also have to mention this now. This is jumping the gun a little bit into the analysis section at the end, but this is such a cool thing, I can't not bring it up after talking about it. So that portion I just mentioned about the judge taking them into the volcano to make gunpowder to fight back against the Apaches is a direct reference to Paradise Lost. A lot of the language of the volcano and the mountain they go to is similar to the caves and mountains that Satan and the eventual armies of hell hide out in during their war with heaven. I talked
Marvelous.
about Paradise Lost on this channel, but if you haven't seen that video or aren't familiar with the work yourself, there's a portion in the story where the angels who are soon to be fallen that have allied themselves with Satan are fighting against the armies of heaven, and the devil decides that they should make gunpowder. And a lot of the language and imagery between the judge taking these men up the volcano to make gunpowder is very similar and harkens back to a lot of the story's themes. McCarthy said that his two primary influences for the character of the judge was Kurtz from Heart of Darkness, which that's another great story and character if you're familiar with that, and Satan from Paradise Lost. That
Very interesting. By the way, the reason I turned on the light is because my eyes are getting a bit too strained by the sharp contrast between the darkness and the light of from my computer screen. So I decided to harsh the mood a bit.
will become more apt as the story goes on. The next day, they are riding through the wilderness, and as they are crossing over a fallen down tree,
So I told the girl, I said,
one of the Delawares jumps over the tree on his horse, and as soon as he does, a grizzly bear rises from right next to him. It had been eating a dead animal, and it growls and picks up the Delaware with its teeth. It just grabs him. The Delaware starts screaming, and the bear runs off, and they never see that guy again. Straight up, they're just going through the woods. A bear grabs a guy, disappears. It says that the other Delawares go to track him, and they come back empty-handed. Just in the midst of everything, a bear eats a dude. It says when the other Delawares get back that they sparse out his belongings between them, and the man's name was never spoken again. Perhaps some of my favorite interactions in the entire story are between the judge and the Glanton gang sitting around the campfire.
Forgot what I was gonna say.
Especially one near the end that we'll get to. The scout I mentioned earlier, Webster, is standing by the campfire and he's watching the judge scribble drawings in his book. Webster asks the judge why he's drawing pictures in the book, and the judge says that it's to catalog all of the earth and everything in it. Webster says that it's impossible to draw everything in the world, and the judge smiles and says, "Well said," and keeps drawing. Webster then follows up and says, "But don't draw a picture of me in that book of yours." As he says this, other people around the campfire
I don't blame him.
began to hoot and holler, saying, "Why do you care if the judge puts your ugly mug in his book? Why do you want to put it in there anyway?" And the judge defends him and says, no, it's because Webster here doesn't want to be chronicled. He doesn't want to be perceived as a certain thing in the eyes of man that may come after him. He doesn't want his image to be whatever I decide it should be. After he finishes, Webster says, "It ain't like that." And the judge says, "Well, good. You won't mind if I draw your picture then."
This judge kid, am I right?
And Webster says, no, I don't want you to draw it, but it ain't like that. There's this weird command the judge has over the emotions and the beliefs of the people around him. Where they're sitting at this moment is in the ruins of the Anasazi. Whenever white settlers first came to this area of Mexico, they saw these old stone houses built into the faces of cliffs, and they assumed that they were built by the current native population. It turned out that these were actually built by a group of people known as the Anasazi. The Anasazi disappeared for some unknown reason, and the modern natives that are simply living in the structures that they built have no idea what happened to them. As the men are there discussing this, discussing who might have made these houses, the judge begins to tell a story. One of my personal favorite things in media, I guess I'm such a nerd, one of my favorite things in stories is whenever the story stops for a moment to tell another story. Most of the time they're very, short and interesting, I find. And the judge tells a story here to this group of men that I feel is worth repeating. So with that, this is the judge's story. In the western country of the Alleghenies some years ago, when it was yet a wilderness, there was a man who kept a harness shop by the side of the federal road. He did so because it was his trade, and yet he did little of it, for there were few travelers in that place. So that he fell into the habit before long of dressing himself as an Indian and taking up station a few miles above his shop and waiting there by the roadside to ask whoever should come that way if they should give him money. At this time, he had done no person any injury. So a harness maker in the middle of the wilderness isn't making that much money, shocker, so he decides to dress himself as a native and go beg for money up the road. One day, a certain man came by, and the harness maker in his beads and feathers stepped from behind his tree and asked this certain man for some coins. He was a young man, and he refused, and having recognized the harness maker for a white man, spoke to him in a way that made the harness maker ashamed, so that he invited the young man to come to his dwelling a few miles distant on the road. This traveler rebukes the harness maker, and he feels so bad about it that he invites the traveler into his home. While in the harness maker's house, the traveler begins to talk of virtue and of good ethics, and decides to give the harness maker a gold coin. After receiving the coin, the harness maker immediately asks if he could have another, or perhaps some more after that. Immediately, the traveler jumps up and begins to berate and yell at the harness maker, saying that he is unjust and not right with God and a greedy man. He says this to the harness maker in front of his family as well. With this, the old man repented all over again and swore that the boy was right, and the old woman who was seated by the fire was amazed at all she had heard. And when the guest announced that the time had come for his departure, she had tears in her eyes, and the little girl came out from behind the bed and clung to his clothes. The old man, the harness maker, so thankful to have received this advice from the traveler, asks the traveler if he can accompany him to the fork in the road, and the traveler agrees. As they walked out, they spoke of life in such a wild place, for such people as you saw but once and never again. And by they came to the fork in the road, and here the traveler told the old man that he had come with him far enough, and he thanked him, and they took their departure each of the other, and the stranger went on his way. Harness maker seemed unable to suffer the loss of his company, and he called, and by they came. Maker seemed unable to suffer the other, and the stranger went on his way. But the harness maker seemed unable to suffer the loss of his company, and he called, and by they came to a place where the road was darkened in a deep wood, and in this place the old man killed the traveler. He killed him with a rock, and he took his clothes, and he took his watch and his money, and he buried him in a shallow grave by the side of the road. Then he went home. On the way, he tore his own clothes and bloodied himself with a flint, and he told his wife they had been set upon by robbers, and the young traveler murdered, and him only escaped. She began to cry, and after a while, she made him take her to the place, and she took wild primrose which grew in plenty thereabout, and she put it on the stones, and she came there many times until she was old. Perhaps because he was ashamed of the traveler, or perhaps because the traveler was such a better man than him, or maybe similar to the way Webster didn't want the judge to write a picture of him in his book. The traveler perceived the harness maker for what he was, and the harness maker wouldn't stand for it. So he kills the traveler and lies to his family, saying that they were set upon by robbers. The harness maker lived until his son was grown and never did anyone harm again. As he lay dying, he called the son to him and told him what he had done. And the son said that he forgave him if it was his to do so, and the old man said that it was his to do so, and then he died. But the boy was not sorry, for he was jealous of the dead man. And before he went away, he visited that place and cast away the rocks and dug up the bones and scattered them in the forest, and then he went away. He went away to the west, and he himself became a killer of men. So the child, who all his life has grown up with the legend that this traveler was a man who was set upon by robbers, now hears at his father's deathbed that his father was the reason this righteous man died. And in response to that, the kid becomes furious. It says he's jealous of the traveler. Maybe the traveler's reputation, or maybe because of his father's attention of him, or who knows. But for some reason or the other, the kid despises this so much that he goes and he throws apart his bones and becomes a killer of men. It says after this, the old woman goes out and regathers the traveler's bones and places them all back in the grave and continues to watch over his final resting place. It's out of my scope to talk about. There's entire college lectures on this book, by the way, that go into different subjects I'm not even going to touch on in this video. It's a very deep book. It's an intensive book with a lot of its imagery. But there is something to be said about how women are portrayed compared to men. Nearly every man in the story, except for maybe the herders at the beginning, and the Mexican general who gave the kid water whenever he was running from the filibuster army. Other than them, every man in the story is barbaric or monstrous in some way. But to that degree, every woman is heartfelt and compassionate. Perhaps McCarthy's saying something about the counter to man's anger, to man's hatred, is the spirit of womanhood. Perhaps it is showing what man is capable of, if not indebted and baptized in the war and blood around them. Who knows? But it does go to mention that every woman in this story seems to be saintly in nature, as seen by even the woman in the judge's story who regathers the bones and takes care of the grave. At the ending of the story, people begin to protest, saying, "No, I've heard that story. You got this detail wrong. And no, he wasn't from here. He was actually from here," and blah, blah, blah. Upon hearing this story and that everyone is familiar with it and that this is a story that has stood the test of time, the judge stops everyone. And he says, "Wait now," he said, "for there's a rider to the tale. There was a young bride waiting for the traveler with whose bones we are acquainted, and she bore a child in her womb that was the traveler's son. Now this son, whose father's existence in this world is historical and speculative, even before the son has entered it, is in a bad way. All his life he carries before him the idol of a perfection to which he can never attain. The father dead has euchred the son out of his patrimony, for it is the death of the father to which the son is entitled and to which he is heir, more so than his goods. He will not hear of the small, mean ways that tempered the man in life. He will not see him struggling in follies of his own devising. No. The world which he inherits bears him false witness. He is broken before a frozen God, and he will never find his way." He's saying this story you're all familiar with. Sure, some of the details are different, but you've all heard of it. Now imagine being the son of the traveler. Your entire life you have the idol of a father you never knew, who everyone tells you, every legend you hear is of the kindness and compassion of your father. But that son, who the judge says is owed the death of his own father, he is heir to it more so than his goods, to see the legacy which came before you. The son is blasphemed with that legacy because he never knew a father in the way most boys would. He never saw how he failed or his shortcomings. He never got to see that his father was human too. And because of that, it says he stands before a frozen God. He constantly has to live up to this expectation of a perfect father who he will never hear as anything other than perfect. Is in a bad way. The judge then continues anything other than perfect, and that is in a bad way. The judge then continues, explaining why he told this story in the first place. What is true of one man, said the judge, is true of many. The people who once lived here are called the Anasazi, the old ones. They quit these parts, routed by drought or disease or by wandering bands of marauders, quit these parts ages since, and of them there is no memory. There are rumors and ghosts in this land, and they are much revered. The tools, the art, building, these things stand in judgment on the latter races. Yet there is nothing for them to grapple with. The old ones are gone like phantoms, and the savages wander these canyons to the sound of an ancient laughter. In their crude huts, they crouch in darkness and listen to the fear seeping out of the rock. All progressions from a higher to a lower order are marked by ruins and mystery and a residue of nameless rage. So, here are the dead fathers. Their spirit is entombed in the stone. It lies upon the land with the same weight and the same ubiquity. For whoever makes a shelter of reeds and hides has joined his spirit to the common destiny of creatures, and he will subside back into the primal mud with scarcely a cry. But who builds in stone seeks to alter the structure of the universe. And so it was with these masons, however primitive, their works may seem to us. The judge says that the people of this country, the modern land, not just the natives, but he's also speaking of the Mexicans and white settlers, especially the white among them in Mexico now. He's saying that all of them are the son of the traveler. They all have the frozen god, as he describes them, dead fathers to look back on, who built these creatures, these statues and monuments out of stone and marble, and here they are building huts out of mud. And if those previous people who walked before you, if they built mountains and idols to God, and you build with twigs, and they didn't make it, and somehow you hope to make it, of what hope does humanity have? It goes to speak of a lot of themes of this story, that despite the superiority that the gang has because they have equipment and guns and food, they are just children toiling at the feet of a dead father. Think back to stories of Europeans during the Dark Ages who built houses out of straw and stone. Imagine them stepping into the ruins
the ruins of the Romans.
of Rome and Greece. Just worms before the feet of a dead god. And then, as a worm trying to survive and make something of yourself, to see that even they fell. What must that have felt like? The gang hears all of this, and everyone's quiet for a minute, thinking on what the judge has said. Until finally, Tobin speaks up. It strikes me, he said, that either son is equal in the way of disadvantage. So what is the way of raising a child? Because the son of the harvest maker became a better outlaw, and the son of the traveler, while not explicitly said, is also bitter and will probably lead a life of violence. At a young age, said the judge, they should be put in a pit with wild dogs. They should be set to puzzle out from their proper clues the one of 3 doors that does not harbor wild lions. They should be made to run naked in the desert until... Now, hold on now, said Tobin. The question was put in all earnestness. And the answer, said the judge. If God meant to interfere in the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? Wolves call themselves man. What other creature could? And is the race of man not more predacious yet? The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die, but in the affairs of men there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening and the evening of his day. He loves games, let him play for stakes. This you see here, these ruins wandered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again? Aye, and again, with other people, with other sons. The judge is saying that everyone is doomed. Every son who is born from here on out, every son that has been, is set to flounder in the monuments before them. That everything that came before is so great, how can one person amass to anything in this world? That's why it says the only way to raise a child is to throw it to the dogs, to make it fight with lions, so that through sheer determination and matter of will, he can become an instrument of something greater than himself. Through trial, he can become a tool, something that matters. And what's interesting about this story that I didn't pick up on the first read is obviously the judge is very harsh here in his depiction of, how children should be. But then it occurred to me that what the judge is describing here is nearly the kid. The kid, like, while he was raised, debatably, by his father until he was 14, ever since then his life has been defined by violence and hate and murder. And perhaps it seems the judge's ideal person, ideal of what a son should be, is what the kid already is. The next day, the game.
I'll tell you what. Was that a judge's man or demon? One thing's for certain is that he's pure evil. I think I'll stop right now and continue later. See you in part 3.